Well, good afternoon. If you are in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, New York City, much of the eastern seaboard of the United States, where this nation was born in 1776, and in North and South America, greetings to people further west in North America and South America. Hello to people in Europe and Africa. Special love, as always, to our loved ones in Ukraine. Stay strong, be yourselves. And greetings to people all around the world, especially in China and especially in Beijing. My guest today is Jennifer Lin, a Philadelphia-born, very experienced and accomplished journalist who for many, many years worked at the Philadelphia Inquirer, one of the nation's great papers, and has written a book, a wonderful book, called Beethoven in Beijing, which tells the stories from the Philadelphia Orchestra's historic journey to China in 1973 and the impact on the culture, on politics that happened at that time. Welcome to Adagio, I should say to you as well. It's Fred Plotkin on Fridays, the place where classical music happens. Adagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to fans all around the world. Jennifer, normally I start with that, but I was so eager to talk to you that I forgot my important part of the introduction. Welcome, Jennifer. Thank you for joining
Hello,
us.
Fred. Well, thank you for having me on your show. I look forward to our conversation.
So it's an oral history, your book is, but I found it very gripping. And I've read many oral histories and I've participated in a few, and I find most of them very dull and very like transcripts and getting down quotes and memories. But your book, because you are an excellent journalist, takes on a narrative and takes on an arc. There's suspense in it, and I've never quite encountered suspense in an oral history before. Did you set out to do that, or it's just your journalistic instincts to know how to present it so suspensefully?
Well, all good to hear, Fred, and thank you. I'm glad you found it compelling, this story and the way I told it. But you know, I spent my lifetime as a journalist, as you mentioned at the intro, 31 years at the Philadelphia Inquirer. So, you know, we're schooled to write taut and clearly. And if you're going to tell a narrative, you know, use the best quotes and that sort of thing. But then I left the newspaper business in 2014, November. And the day that I signed my papers to leave the Philadelphia Inquirer, I sat down with the woman who did PR for the Philadelphia Orchestra, and I pitched to her the idea of doing a documentary about the orchestra's China legacy. This is a long way of answering your question, but it relates. What came first before the book was the documentary by the same name, Beethoven in Beijing. And I worked on that for 5 years, and it came out on PBS's Great Performances in April of last year. And in writing a script for a documentary, I found that it was much like writing an oral history. And so with the script for the movie, you know, you do need to make it dramatic and, you know, choose the best words. So writing the oral history, it kind of wasn't a big leap from one to the other. And, you know, the book was basically my COVID project, because the movie, we finished the movie in March of 2020. We locked the movie. And when you use the word locked in filmmaking, it means lock the key, you throw the key away, you can't go back in and keep tinkering and tinkering. So we locked it on March the 1st, 2020. Guess what happened 2 weeks later?
Yeah.
So there you know, we had planned on spending the whole year going to film festivals and introducing the movie, and all the film festivals went virtual. So they all became like this, you know, and it's just not the same. And so I found myself in my attic office, which you see in the background, you know, with basically nothing to do. So I had always kind of entertained the idea of writing a book based on the documentary, and this just gave me the impetus to do it. And I really wanted to tell it as oral history because, for one thing, I had a lot of material that never made the movie. I mean, I spent years and years and years researching this topic. And so I had like files and files and interviews where, you know, you're only using like a few quotes from a hour-long interview. And so I did a lot more reporting, though, for the oral history. And, you know, there are things in the book that are never mentioned in the movie, but it really became a fun way to tell the story. I don't find writing as a fun exercise. I find writing is really hard work. And there is a lot of writing in Beethoven in the book. There's a lot of, you know, I set things up a lot and I tell a lot of the context and the history, but it is oral history, and it was a lot more fun to kind of piece it together. You know, easier in a way, but you know, there was a bigger reason for telling it as oral history, and that is that I wanted the musicians who were part of this experience, both American and Chinese, to tell the story in their own words. And I wanted to get out of the way as a writer. I didn't want to interpret so much. I wanted them to speak for themselves. Again, it's history, and this is their primary sources. So I thought, you know, I really wanted to record their memories. So anyway, that's a long answer.
That's fine. One of the things among many that I liked, two of them really, is one is that you, at the beginning of the book, kind of like reading the program of an opera or a play, you have the characters.
Yeah.
And what families they belong to, whether they're the US government, the Chinese government, Chinese musicians, American musicians, the orchestra itself, the Philadelphia Orchestra, Eugene Ormandy, its very charismatic and complicated music director and conductor. His wife and her role, Mao Zedong's wife, Madame Mao, and her very powerful role in China's culture and being the arbiter of taste in China. We're going to get into that. But the second thing is that as I read through the book and read all of their comments, I could begin to see the personalities of these different people and see them not simply as observers, but as characters. And when for me, they became characters in the story, that's what ratcheted up the drama for me a lot. Because we know that the Philadelphia Orchestra went to China in the fall of 1973. We know that they were the first American orchestra to do that. So there's not suspense in that. And yet there was suspense in how it happened. I've bookmarked a page that I'll read. I could have asked you to read it yourself, but I think I'll do it.
Okay.
It's chapter 2, White House Calling. On January 20th, 1973, Richard Nixon was inaugurated for his second term. In a break from tradition, he honored Eugene Ormandy by requesting that the Philadelphia Orchestra perform at a concert at the Kennedy Center. It was interpreted as an overt snub to the National Symphony Orchestra, the hometown orchestra in Washington, D.C., which was accustomed to carrying out inauguration duties. In Philadelphia, there was also a backlash. A few musicians did not want to perform, protesting Nixon's handling of the Vietnam War. The inauguration appearance was, as Boris Sokolov, the orchestra manager, told the Associated Press, a political nightmare, but it paid dividends for Eugene Ormandy. A month later, February 20th, 1973, the conductor was nursing a cold in his apartment at the Barclay Hotel on Rittenhouse Square in Philadelphia when the phone rang at 4:46 p.m. An operator told Ormandy that the president wished to talk to him. Which president, Maestro Ormandy?
Yeah.
The one in the White House, he was told. And now we have the transcript of the conversation. Nixon, Mr. Ormandy, how are you, Mr. President? How are you? Thank you. A little sick. Otherwise, I'm fine. Nixon, I'm just sitting here talking to Dr. Kissinger. He's just back from China. I know. Nixon said, I thought you might be interested to know that when he was talking to our friends in China, Mr. Zhou Enlai, now this has to be held till Thursday, but I thought you'd like to know, they're going to invite the Philadelphia Symphony to come to China, Ormady. That's wonderful. Nixon. So I just want you to know that my favorite symphony will be the first one to go to China. It will be a great experience for all of your people. Ormady. It's a great honor. Nixon. I think it must have embarrassed you a little when some of them didn't want you to play at my inauguration. Now that the war is over, they probably feel a little bad about it, but you stood up to them. Thank you, Mr. President. You honor me. You honor the orchestra. I'm very proud and happy. Nixon, we're most appreciative. I'll let Dr. Kissinger tell you about the conversation. Would you like to hear about it? If I may. Here he is, said Nixon. Kissinger, Mr. Ormandy. Hello, Dr. Kissinger. Nice to talk to you. I was talking with the Chinese leaders about exchanges, and they said to me the president had taken a special interest in the Philadelphia Symphony, that he had taken a trip to Philadelphia once, and you agreed to play at the inauguration. So the first Western Symphony Orchestra to come to China should be the Philadelphia Symphony. So, number one, it's the Philadelphia Orchestra, not the Philadelphia Symphony.
We'll forgive him that one.
But I mean, what I love in this transcript, apart from envisioning the conversation and Ormandy being polite but not giving in much, is that the Vietnam War was behind it, the inauguration was behind it, the jealousy in the classical music world. There were so many elements that happen in a page and a half. Yeah. And that's what I mean about your ability to synthesize and make it work, and there's no extra fat on it. Why was Nixon in love with the Philadelphia Orchestra?
Yeah. Well, first of all, Fred, I want to commend you for your voices.
Thank
you did a very good Ormandy and a very good Kissinger. Oh, you did?
I knew Ormandy, yes. I cooked for Eugene Ormandy.
What? Well, tell me about that before I tell you about my story.
I had a relative who was an artist and repertoire manager at Columbia Records in the 1960s when I was a kid. And I was a good cook as a kid, and all the artists who recorded for Columbia wound up at our house, and I would often cook the dinners. And Ormandy was there, and he took an interest in me because we had a piano and we would talk about music. And my great fortune as a kid was that all these musicians would come over and I would cook and they would talk. And this is a lot of my training came in these conversations that I had with musicians, including Ormandy, because like most musicians I've known, if they meet a kid who's interested in the subject matter, they put everything aside. They take off their grandeur and they talk to the kid about music. And he liked my cooking. So
wow. Well, just a quick aside, this doesn't answer your question that you asked me, but so like when they were on tour, the big question was, would Ormandy eat with everyone? Because whenever he would tour, poor Gretel, his wife, used to have to make him a steak in their hotel room because he was such a picky eater.
Yeah.
And finally, like the diplomats got to him and said, Mr. Ormandy, maestro, please join us for these banquets because this is about diplomacy, not just performance. So he departed from his usual meal in his hotel room with Gretel, and he joined everyone for these big banquets. But so back to Nixon, I'm glad you read that section for a couple of reasons. Like I just like the moment, but how I got that is also, there's a story behind it. But Fred, I want to ask you, did you know much about Chinese history, modern Chinese history, before you read the book?
I made a visit to China. I resolved to climb the Great Wall on my 40th birthday, which is 26 years ago. Mm-hmm. And so I structured my life to be in China in May of 1996. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I read up a fair amount before. Mm-hmm. And I read a few of the famous books about China, but I didn't feel I read enough books by Chinese people about China. Mm-hmm. but just
Mhm.
so-called China hands, which is a term I've never liked, but people who
Yeah.
study
Yeah.
China. I've read Pearl S. Buck and that
Yeah.
view of China, but I I was completely taken with Beijing in 1996
Mhm.
because among the many things that struck me
Mhm.
were how much people laughed.
Mm.
Because
Mm.
in the same trip I visited Japan and Korea, there was not so much laughter in those
Yeah.
countries, but in China, there was raucous laughter. People had fun. I
Yeah.
went to Chinese opera. I was out on the streets. It was very
Yeah.
animated life. And this was
Yeah.
not the China of now. I know that completely.
Yeah.
But people were, for the most part, incredibly welcoming. I had a great time. And this was a period when China was not as open to the world as it is
Yeah.
now. And so that was my experience. So
Yeah.
in coming to the book, I was drawn to it by my experience in China those years ago.
So one of the reasons why I wanted to make the movie and write the book is I felt like this was such an important moment in US China history that not a lot of people knew. I mean, everyone knows about ping pong diplomacy, but not a lot of people know about music diplomacy, even in the orchestra's hometown of Philadelphia. So I really, my background is my father's Chinese, and I grew up with a fascination with China, and have been kind of a student of China for a long time. I'm not a classical musician. I'm not an expert or a classical music critic, but I am interested in China, and I just thought this was an interesting, important story to tell. And that this orchestra has a unique place in Chinese history, and there's such nostalgia for this orchestra. So this is yet another long answer to your short question, but when I wrote the book and when I put together the documentary, I made a point of trying to place this in the context of the history of the moment. And so, unfortunately, China is barely taught in high schools, Chinese history. And this isn't meant to be judgmental, but not a lot of Americans understand modern Chinese history. So with both the book and the film, what I tried to do is introduce kind of what was happening around this trip. And so that's why it's so important to focus on Nixon. So 1972, Nixon makes his historic trip to China to begin the process of opening up China. And so what not a lot of people understand today, I mean, people of our generation remember, but if you talk to 30 somethings or younger, they think of China today as China, this strong economy, open society, not open society, but place that many people go to. 1972, we did not have relations with China, and China was in the midst of the Cultural Revolution. And, again, not being judgmental, but a lot of people hear Cultural Revolution and they think, oh, it's positive, it's about culture, No, it was very destructive. It was a period of anarchy, chaos, and violence. And classical musicians in particular in China really paid the price. So, beginning in 1966, musicians in China were not allowed to perform Western classical music. They could only play revolutionary music. That was the point of the Cultural Revolution, to get, away with the old, in with the new, and doing so by whatever means necessary. Violence, Red Guards, the Mao's wife was in charge of a group that later became known as the Gang of Four, and they were ruthless. So, you have to know all that. And I try to explain this in the book, kind of, from the first chapter. You have to understand that to then recognize why this trip was so important. So when they touched down in China, the Philadelphia Orchestra, at the time, there were fewer than 100 Americans living in China. Now, think about that. Like, one plane from New York to Beijing carries like hundreds of travelers. And I mean, there are literally thousands of Americans prior to the pandemic who would be going to China on a daily basis. But back in 73, when the orchestra went, they were an oddity. They were rare. The Chinese public hadn't heard a Western orchestra since 1949. So, it's like that background that's so important to my story that I want to tell. So back to the whole Nixon conversation that you highlighted. I'm really glad you picked that because, I'm a reporter. I mean, this is my DNA. And that was one of my discoveries that I was most proud of. So the way I found that conversation is, I love research. I could spend days and days in archives. So I spent a lot of time in the archives at Temple University. They have all the newspapers, on file there, the actual hard copies. You get these envelopes and you open them up and you see all the articles. And so, I created kind of a timeline of when did they get the invitation to go to China. And it was in February of 1973. So for the documentary, I had done a lot of research at the Nixon Library. Again, because this was one of Nixon's great accomplishments, was opening up China. And the Nixon Library is just a magnificent repository of material. And to their credit, they have digitized a lot of the outtakes from Nixon's trip to China, and it's all on YouTube and it's all available for free for filmmakers like myself. So I relied on a lot of that footage to kind of create the context visually of of this trip to China by the orchestra. This is in the documentary. So when I was like looking around the library website, I noticed that there were all of these audio files. Remember, Nixon liked to tape his conversations, and by an act of Congress, those are the public domain. We are well aware of, this topic these days, but the Nixon audio files became public. And so, I knew when they announced that the Philadelphia Orchestra was going to China, it was February 1973. So I went into the Nixon archives, the audio archives, and they have it all indexed by date. And I called up all of the files for February, and lo and behold, there's one that says Ormandy. And I'll never forget that. I clicked on this file, and it is like a pristine recording of Nixon picking up the phone to talk to Ormandy. And I remember calling my executive producer, Sam Katz, and I said, Sam, you will not believe what I found, So it's in the movie, and it's also in the book, just this exchange. And Kissinger literally had just gotten off a plane from China. He had gone in February to do a follow-up meeting with the Chinese. Nixon went to China February, I think it was 1972. And so Kissinger, had been there for many days, negotiating the terms of something. And so I was able to locate that audio file, and I used the transcript in the book. So yeah, as a reporter, I had a lot of moments like that where it was like eureka moments, but that was one of my favorite. And so Nixon liked Ormandy. Nixon, was a classical musician. He played the piano. Yeah. And he used to listen to the albums of the Philadelphia Orchestra, which had a real reputation for their the albums that they would do, their recordings. And that was really Stokowski and then Ormandy. They really had a great following. So Nixon knew the orchestra from the recordings, and then Ormandy was a real political player. He knew how to work it, and the scene I set up in the beginning of the book is, Ormandy reading about the ping pong players going to China in 1971 and turning to his general manager saying, Boris, how do you get an invitation like that? Get me an invitation. And they're like, okay. But so then Ormandy worked all of his political contacts, Senator Scott from Pennsylvania, I think Walter Annenberg, who ran the Philadelphia Inquirer back then, I think he was probably called in to work it. So, Ormandy had cultivated Nixon, and he was determined to get the first invitation. But, as you know from reading the book, the Chinese had a soft spot for the Philadelphia Orchestra, because back in 1940, when China was embroiled in a war with Japan, the Republic of China, the nationalist government, they were basically on a charm offensive in the United States to drum up support. And they were able, to get groups like the Philadelphia Orchestra to do fundraisers for them. So the orchestra had a concert in 1940 at the Academy of Music to raise money for the medical relief effort in China, because they were fighting a war. And the Chinese don't forget their friends. They don't forget their enemies too. But in this case, when Nixon, when his side suggested the Philadelphia Orchestra, the Chinese side, led by the premier Zhou Enlai, said, "Oh yeah, we like them. We remember they had a concert for us back in 1940." And this kept getting mentioned over and over again when they were on tour in China, like Madame Mao, the wife of Chairman Mao, Jiang Qing. She actually brought it up when she was talking to Ormandy. So yeah, Ormandy was a political animal.
So you mentioned many wonderful things, and because a lot of our viewers are outside the United States, I want to fill in a certain amount of facts and so on. Eugene Ormandy was born in Hungary in 1899. He was Jewish. He showed musical talent early. His father was a dentist. They got out. Let's leave it at that. Their name was not Ormandy, it was Blau. Somehow the name Ormandy was invented around 1918, and he wound up in New York, and it was violinist and showed a lot of talent, and conducted the Philadelphia Orchestra for the first time in 1931. Became co-music director with Leopold Stokowski in 1936, became music director in 1938, and was in that job until 1980. The orchestra was founded in 1900. And it had a couple of brief heads, and then Leopold Stokowski from 1912 to 1938. So what that orchestra has known in the formation of its sound were really these two men, and then others after, such as Riccardo Muti, Wolfgang Sawallisch, and Christoph Eschenbach, now Yannick Nézet-Séguin, briefly Charles Dutoit, continued this tradition. I've had many Philadelphians on this program because I love Philadelphia for its music, for its food, for lots of things. And it's an incredible city artistically. The orchestra is ranked or named among the top 5 in America. Let's see, Boston, Cleveland, Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, not in any order. I think other orchestras, including Atlanta, Los Angeles, San Francisco, the National Symphony now in Washington with John Andrea Noceda, can all compete at that level. But Philadelphia Orchestra has this history. It has a recorded history as well. And now that fewer recordings are made, we use references to older recordings, especially New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, and to some degree, Cleveland and Boston. And therefore, when we in America talk about these orchestras, we talk about their legacy. Philadelphia has the Academy of Music. It has the Curtis Institute. It's incredibly rich in musical culture. But a question that I want to ask you, the reporter who has also covered a lot of economics, is the following. Orchestras nowadays in America receive a lot of funding support from corporations, from foundations, and so on. Philadelphia is a wonderful city. It's one of the largest in America, but it has very few what we call Fortune 500 companies. It had foundations such as Pew and Annenberg, Walter Annenberg, the name you mentioned. Nancy Reagan was a friend of the Annenbergs, and the Annenbergs fueled culture. You know, in America, we talk about the right and the left, the Republicans and Democrats. Until relatively recently, Republicans funded the arts. Richard Nixon was a great advocate for the arts. The Reagans, in their way, were George Bush Sr. to some degree, But it was not partisan. Dwight David Eisenhower helped build Lincoln Center. He fostered the Kennedy Center along with Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. It was a bipartisan thing, and Nixon created the National Endowment for the Arts. But nowadays, our arts companies rely on funding from corporations and foundations. Philadelphia, despite its magnificent legacy of this fantastic world-class orchestra, struggles in part because it's not a city that has Fortune 500 companies and foundations. Do you want to, as a native Philadelphian, do you want to talk about that and how it's experienced in the city?
Yeah, I mean, you hit on something like really important, Fred, and it's not something that you can change. I mean, everything you say is absolutely true. And but I want to preface my answer by saying today the Philadelphia Orchestra is in a much better place than 10 years ago financially. And yes, unfortunately, our country doesn't support the arts like European nations, China, Asian nations. And this comes out in the film, not in the book. But, you know, the Philadelphia Orchestra a decade ago had to file for bankruptcy protection, which you get protection from your creditors, and then you come up with a plan to get out of bankruptcy, and this has to go before a judge. And that process all happened 10 years ago. And again, they are much stronger today in 2022 than they were a decade ago. But it's a constant battle. One thing I point out in the film that, again, isn't in the book. In the book, I don't go into what happened with the bankruptcy and everything, but in the movie, you know, I had a clip from Ormandy. So one of the things I found in my research was a hour-long audio file at the Library of Congress of Ormandy. When he came back from China, he gave a press conference. So it's this great audio. And he was asked by a reporter about, you know, in some countries, they support the arts. Is this something we need to do in the United States? And Ormandy, so this is 1974 was the actual press conference. He's bringing up the subject of finances then. I mean, this is like 50 years ago. This is like not a new issue. This is a lingering issue and challenge for all orchestras across America. I mean, even in New York, which has more Fortune 500 companies than anywhere. So, you know, Ormandy back in 74 was saying, even if we fill the Academy of Music, we still lose money, like $8,000 a performance. And so I intentionally put that into the film because this isn't a new problem. This is a problem that dates back 50 years, basically. So, you know, this is the horrible fact of life for orchestras across America. How do you, when the audiences are, you know, not growing robustly, how do you survive? The Philadelphia Orchestra, again, to its credit, has been making like a strong effort to build their audience. They have expanded their international reach. They've been to China 12 times. They frequently tour Japan and Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, you know, you name it. So they realize that they're not just an orchestra for the city of Philadelphia, they're an orchestra that is really world renowned. So, you know, it's a hard one. Luckily for us, we have the charismatic conductor, Yannick Nézet-Séguin, and he is really just a city treasure. And the Philadelphians love him. The orchestra, you know, he gets a lot of support from his musicians, and he brings a vitality and an energy to the Philadelphia Orchestra that hasn't been seen, you know, in a long time. And he's just marvelous at not only like, you know, bringing younger people into the orchestra, but also the programming is you know, very dynamic. The orchestra currently is highlighting several Black composers and female composers and female conductors. Yannick is very intentional, and you know, they're actually putting all this DEI language to practice. And
What
they
is
are,
DEI for our listeners?
so DEI is a acronym that many here in the United States would be familiar with, and it stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's this idea of making the classical arts broader, more expansive in terms of audience and content. I mean, in a nutshell, that's what it is. And the orchestra really is, putting on some, very, different types of programs from, say, like 15, 20 years ago, and trying to make classical music more inclusive.
One thing I want to add about Philadelphia, the orchestra, and then we'll get back to China, is there's something we all know if we know music called the Philadelphia sound, which is very recognizable. Certain orchestras, including Chicago, definitely have their sound. Vienna has its sound. Berlin, in a way, does. The New York Philharmonic is more like New York City. It's happily anarchical and not, it doesn't have a sound in the same way. But Philadelphia has this incredibly rich string section. And part of that relates to the fact that the department store in Philadelphia, Wanamaker's, many, many years ago, purchased and permanently lent, I believe it's 65 stringed instruments to the Philadelphia Orchestra. And when a player leaves the orchestra, she or he does not take the instrument home, but it goes to the person who occupies the chair next. And therefore, these instruments are a legacy that create the sound, because in other orchestras, when a player arrives, he or she brings the instrument and then goes at the end. These form the nucleus, and that's part of the concept of the sound.
Now that sounds apocryphal, Fred.
No, it's really not. I did a presentation for the orchestra years ago in Philadelphia where I spoke to that, and I did the research.
Okay.
You as a Philadelphian can go and look into that, but I did the research in Philadelphia when I did that.
This is the version I've heard of what the Philadelphia sound is and how it happened. And I got this from some of the violinists who I include in the book. Larry Gritka, for instance, who's one of the veterans of 73, and Herb Light. So they told me that a lot of it had to do with the Academy of Music, this old opera house, that it actually wasn't a great venue for an orchestra, and that it had a very dry environment. So to compensate for that, the string sections had to be more lush. And that's how the Philadelphia sound developed under Stokowski, I think, not Ormandy. So that's
it could well be both. It could be both.
Yeah.
That if you have these great instruments, then you use them to accentuate or compensate for the acoustical issues in your hall.
Yeah.
The new hall is called the Kimmel Center or the Verizon Center. I always forget which one it's called.
Yeah, Kimmel.
And there are people who don't like that acoustic.
Yeah.
Acoustics. I'm going to have an acoustician on very soon on this show, and I will talk to him about acoustics and what are good acoustics. But let's go back to China. When the orchestra landed, actually, let me go back a little before that. What were the discussions between China and Philadelphia and perhaps Washington about what music would be played? And then once they got to China, I know the answer because your book told me. Then what happened when they actually got to China?
Yeah. So, Fred, one of the discoveries I made when researching the book was I would periodically Google Philadelphia Orchestra in China. Just this is like a reporter's habit. You just never know what might turn up. And lo and behold, I stumbled upon a trove of cables that were made public by WikiLeaks. Julian Assange. Well, within these unclassified, cables were all these correspondence back and forth between the Americans on the ground in Beijing. Now, remember, we didn't have embassy, but we had an office. So after Nixon went to China, both sides agreed that you can have an office. So there was a liaison office. And the guy, the mid-level diplomat who was in charge of the Philadelphia Orchestra's visit was a man named Nick Platt. So I found all these cables between Nick Platt and his colleague at the State Department, Francis Tenney. And it was all the back and forth between these two guys trying to organize and get ready for this big tour. And it gives you kind of an idea of not only the complexity of it, but how they treated this at such a high level diplomatically, as if they were negotiating some sort of treaty. So the Philadelphia Orchestra, whenever they travel and tour, those tours are arranged like a year in advance. The programs are set like a year in advance. And it was literally like weeks before the Philadelphians were about to take off, where they still hadn't cemented what the programs were going to be. The Chinese side was incapable of making decisions on programming. First of all, the fact that they were weighing in on the program at all was indicative of how different this tour was, how it was being treated and as a diplomatic mission rather than just a performance. So the Chinese got to say, like, they weren't crazy about the Soviets at the moment. So can you leave the Tchaikovsky behind? And there were some others that they found, too risque for whatever reason. Debussy, for I don't know why, but the Chinese just they didn't want certain things, but they weren't telling Ormandy what they wanted. So there was one cable that I quote in the book where it's kind of snarky. The guy in Washington at the State Department is cabling Nick Platt in Beijing saying, Maestro would like to know what he's going to play before he steps on the stage. So can you prod the Chinese side to kind of get with us and tell us what to play? So they did, they had, I forget how many different programs they had. It was like 3 or 4, I can't remember. There were like 4 performances in Beijing, 3 in Shanghai, and they had like, I think it was 3, and they just rotated them. So they showed up, thinking they were going to play certain things, and then Madame Mao kind of threw a wrench into it. Do you want me to keep going, Fred, and tell the audience what happened? Or
I do want you to keep going.
Yeah.
I just want to make one brief comment. Nick Platt is a very charismatic figure in your book and very central to the book. I've not seen your documentary, and I will now see it. Is he as prominent in the documentary as he is in the book? Okay.
He's great.
He's really wonderful.
Yeah. So the other, Nick Platt is an important character, but some of the Chinese musicians too, really, Tan Dun, the composer. But anyway, take it away, Fred.
So now tell us what Madame Mao wanted for her music.
Yeah, so the Philadelphians land first in Shanghai because you couldn't land the plane in Beijing. I can't remember why, but for whatever reason, they landed in Shanghai, and then they had to take a Chinese plane from Shanghai to Beijing. And again, Nick Platt's job was to basically babysit Eugene Ormandy and Gretel. And he and his wife, they, were constantly at the side of the Ormandys. So Nick Platt, when he arrived in Shanghai, the Chinese officials kept bugging him about, we want Ormandy to play Beethoven 6. And Nick's like, well, it's not on the program, but, I'll see what I can do. So Ormandy lands, they get on this commuter flight to go to Beijing, and Nick is sitting next to him and says, Maestro, we have a request from the top. They'd like to hear Beethoven 6. And Ormandy was a diva, and no one tells him what to do. He said, well, I didn't come ready to play the 6, and I don't like the 6, so we're not doing the 6. And Platt is like, oh God, I have to convince him that he needs to change his plans. So the flight continues, and he keeps prodding Ormandy gently, like, Maestro, and as he says in the book and also in the movie, he began to make things up. He said, the Chinese regime came to power as part of a peasant revolution, and the Pastorelle, Beethoven 6, is all about peasants. So they have this affinity for the 6th, not the 5th. And so Platt just wore him down. And finally, again, Ormandy was shrewd. He knew that this was more than just a tour to make money. This was a tour to repair relations and to improve kind of how the Chinese perceived the Americans. So he didn't want it to fail. And so he said, fine, whatever. But then when they landed in Beijing, he said, and the Chinese, the hosts were, pushing Ormandy too to play the sixth. And Ormandy said, but we don't have the scores. We didn't come prepared. We came prepared to play the fifth. We didn't come prepared to play the sixth. And the Chinese said, don't worry, we'll get them. So they literally dispatched a military jet to Shanghai to pick up some scores. And they got like 70 from the Central Conservatory or the Central Philharmonic in
Shanghai,
Beijing.
because the Shanghai Symphony is the oldest in China, and Shanghai, I've not been, but this is what we all know, was an open port. It had a German presence, a Jewish presence, an international presence, and therefore more likely to have a symphony that would have the scores for Beethoven's Sixth Symphony.
So they didn't have enough scores in Beijing. The Central Phil didn't have enough scores, so they had to go to Shanghai. Shanghai Symphony, by the way, is older than the Philadelphia Orchestra, and that was made up mostly, of expats, as you indicated, many from Eastern Europe. But anyway, so they cobbled together 100 plus scores, and they handed them out to the musicians, and most of them were hand scored, because during the Cultural Revolution, scores would have been destroyed during the mayhem. Conservatories were targeted, and so as a sign of how revolutionary everyone was, they would have burned a lot of the scores. So the musicians had to, rewrite them. And so the musicians in Philadelphia, they gave me some great quotes. Like, they picked up the scores and it's like, whoops, this isn't right, this is wrong. But as one musician said, you're talking about the Philadelphia Orchestra, you're talking about Beethoven. We could play Beethoven, with our eyes shut. So
I just wanted, for listeners who may not be that musical, I want to point out a couple of things. One is that when music is copied, even the best, most diligent person can make a mistake. So a C could become a C sharp. An eighth note could become a 16th note. And if you have two scores and one of them is C, the other C sharp, one of them is the eighth, one's the 16th, how do you decide which is best unless you know the original? There's that, but also, in my understanding, and I think I gleaned this from your book, that the Fifth Symphony, which is what Ormandy wanted to play, shows off an orchestra better than does the Sixth, which is more pastoral, as it's called. Whereas the Fifth Symphony, the famous opening notes are ba 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 bum, is known as fate knocking at the door. And I don't think that China wanted a symphony about fate. And so they wanted something that was about nature, agriculture, the beauty of nature, serenity, harmony, I think is an important concept there, balance. And that's why the Sixth speaks to that more than does the Fifth.
Yeah, you're good, Fred. I should have hired you to do annotations for my book. But
we'll do something else in the future.
Yeah, and Fred, help me with this too, because the musicians told me that Ormandy, when he saw this hodgepodge of scores, told the musicians, go back to free bowing, that they used to do free bowing when they were with Stokowski. So explain what that is, because again, I'm not a classical musician, but
I'm a wind guy, not a string guy, but my knowledge is that I don't want to mischaracterize, but I have a feeling that it's a little bit more about the breathing and the open expression rather than a very defined version. And again, I'm being very approximative. But later music, which is to say Stravinsky, the early 20th century, when Ormandy and Stokowski were working, being formed, was a lot more precise about instructions than might have been Mozart or Beethoven even, where the breath might be longer in a bow. Yeah,
and so the musicians, when they were telling me about this, they said he was telling them to be, more interpretive, that don't, because it's not in the score, just kind of, go with your own.
Another way to express this when you talk about it is 20th century music was recorded often with the people who wrote the music, Richard Strauss,
Right.
Puccini,
Mhm.
Gershwin, I don't know about Debussy, but the others, Ravel, certainly,
Rachmaninoff.
Rachmaninoff.
Yeah. Yeah.
And therefore, we have a very precise idea of their
Mhm.
intentions.
Mhm.
Whereas Beethoven never entered a recording studio, or
Yeah.
Mozart or Schubert, and
Yeah.
therefore we rely on the printed page and on the tradition passed down from our
Right.
teachers, so that
Right.
Philadelphia, as I said, has
Yeah.
wonderful music academies.
Yeah.
There are teachers who claim their heritage going back
Yeah.
to Eugene Say, was a Belgian violinist who taught
Yeah.
many people.
Yeah.
Depending which school you came from as a
Yeah.
tradition, many of them were Russians, you play differently. And maybe I
Yeah.
think that's part of it. Whereas 20th century music and up to the present date, we have all sorts of electronic documentation.
Yeah. Yeah. And
So
on the
free
point,
bowing is a bit, interpretive in a way that current music would not be.
yeah, and on the point you just made about Curtis, Gary Graffman is a character in our film. Gary Graffman, is a noted pianist and also was the mentor of Lang Lang, Yu Jia Wang, and Zhang Haochen, like arguably three of the greatest piano soloists of recent time. And there's a part in the film where Gary talks about this lineage that you speak of, where basically he and the other teachers at Curtis can trace the lineage all the way back to Beethoven, because of who their teachers were.
Gary Graffman was a guest on this program a couple of years ago.
Oh yeah.
He wrote a book called I Really Should Be Practicing.
Oh, I love that book. It is so funny.
And he was one of those people who I cooked for when I was a kid.
Yeah.
And so, and he headed Curtis for many years, and
He
he's still very active and teaching
Yeah.
and working in his apartment in New York.
Yeah.
And so people who do not know Gary Graffman want to go back and rediscover him. They should know him.
That's a gem of a book.
Yeah. So anyway, ultimately, I gather that they played the sixth and not the fifth.
So they played the sixth for what they called the leadership concert. And this was the one where Madame Mao showed up. They did perform the fifth, but just not for her. She wanted the sixth, so they played the sixth. But they did the fifth one other time in Beijing and once in Shanghai. Actually, Fred, I have a cousin who's a pianist, classically trained, and she was at the Shanghai Conservatory as a teenager when the Cultural Revolution started. And then they closed the conservatories during the Cultural Revolution. They were still open, but instead of learning music, it was all political indoctrination. And my cousin in 1973, though, had a job as an accompanist for like a revolutionary lyric opera company. And so because she was a working musician, she got a ticket to go hear the Philadelphia Orchestra.
Yeah.
And she said it was just remarkable to like hear them playing Beethoven, because it was like being in the desert and getting a drink of water that had been so long since they heard not only this music, but performed by an orchestra of such a high caliber that it was just unforgettable for many.
I want to point out to listeners that in your book, you mention a lot of the music that was played. Mm-hmm. And I've put links on the Adagio show page for everything played by the Philadelphians. Barber's Adagio for strings, Beethoven Symphony No. 6, Brahms Symphony No. 1, Mozart Symphony No. 35, Hafner, Respighi's The Pines of Rome, which is a big orchestral showpiece, and the Yellow River Concerto for piano and orchestra we'll talk about in a moment. But therefore, if you are an Adagio subscriber, you can go and hear all the music as played by the Philadelphians. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the Yellow River Concerto now before I pivot to a slightly different Chinese musical topic.
And I like the Yellow River Concerto. I'll just say that outright. So go ahead, Fred.
Well, not everyone does, and that's okay. Yeah. I do. I listened to it carefully in preparation for this conversation. And my understanding is it was a bit of a collaboration that created this concerto rather than our knowing the composer. And the Yellow River for China has remarkable symbolism that you can recount better than I. And it's kind of like we have Ferdy Groffet in America who wrote about the
Yeah.
Mississippi.
Yeah.
And it's the same connotation of national identity, of transitive movement, of music born on rivers, which happens a lot. Certainly the Danube, the Seine, the Arno, and all these rivers around the world have been places where music has been born, and opera was born in Florence at the Arno River.
Mhm.
And Danube in Vienna, we don't even have to mention how much music is
Mhm.
from there, and the Thames in London. And it seems that places where important rivers flow are also places where musical people gather.
Yeah.
And so please talk about the Yellow River Concerto, how it wound
Yeah.
up on the programs. And I know the answer, but who played the piano?
Yeah. So actually, Ormandy was able to find out more about the Yellow River Concerto because the soloist, Yin Chenzong, he was a soloist. He was talking to Ormandy, and he is actually the person who wrote the Yellow River Concerto. But back in the Cultural Revolution, you couldn't claim attention for yourself. It had to be more of a committee. So there was a committee that wrote the music, but mostly it was Yin Chenzong with probably input from the conductor Li Dulun, who was the conductor of the Central Philharmonic. And so the Yellow River Concerto is, a work of music that means a lot to the Chinese. But what gets me is like, okay, the critics, Harold Schoenberg from the New York Times, and the guy from the Washington Post, I forget his name, but Schoenberg was on tour with the orchestra, but the Washington Post critic heard the Yellow River Concerto when they were doing kind of a rehearsal concert in Saratoga. The Philadelphia Orchestra spends its summers in Saratoga, New York, and they wanted to do kind of a run through before they went on tour. So they did the Yellow River Concerto. And the guy from the Post just ripped it. And like, I forget exactly if it was Schoenberg or the Post guy, but like calling it drivel and nothing more than Hollywood film music. It's like, okay, guys, calm down. It's just something that means a lot to the Chinese. And actually, Ormandy is pretty shrewd by putting it on the program. So, with the critics. But there is if I could share a fun story, this isn't in the movie, it's just in the book, but during this concert in Saratoga, again, a run up to the tour where they wanted to practice things before a live audience, Ormandy wanted to do the Yellow River Concerto. And he had the conductor's score, but he didn't have the score for the pianist. And so, long story short, there was he wanted this pianist Yin to come to Saratoga to perform with them before they went on tour. But there was no way in hell the Chinese government was going to give him a visa to go to the United States to perform with Ormandy. So Ormandy had to find someone locally who could perform the Yellow River Concerto. There was a recent graduate of Juilliard by the name of Daniel Epstein. Now, again, this is the 1970s, and he kind of had a curiosity about China. And for some reason, Daniel went to the Chinese mission to the UN. And this was like after he graduated in the early 70s and said, hey, I'm interested in Chinese music. What do you have? And they actually gave him the score for the Yellow River Concerto. So Ormandy and the Philadelphia Orchestra heard that there was this pianist in New York City who might know how to play the Yellow River Concerto. So they called up Daniel. He's like in his early 20s. And they said, Ormandy would like for you to come up and audition to play this role. And this is like maybe 10 days before the actual concert. And Daniel's like, yeah, sure, I can do it. He could not do it. He was like faking his way through it. And so he goes home, he drives up, he was rehearsing it, he was practicing. He drives up to Saratoga to perform for Ormandy, to audition for him, with the music, and pulls it off. And Ormandy said, yeah, you're hired. So Daniel is on his way back to New York City and like frantically trying to practice this Yellow River Concerto when his wife's mother or father, I think it was mother, died in Japan. Mm. So all of a sudden he's on a flight to Japan and taking the score with him on the flight and like practicing just like playing the notes with the score, goes to Japan, attends the funeral, flies back to New York, again, frantically practicing, and then heads up to Saratoga. And he said that, the Friday that he was performing, like all the country's national press corps was there, like ABC News, CBS, AP, Washington Post, because this was a big deal. This tour was a big deal. So they all came to hear, what Ormandy would be playing in China. And so Daniel's like this 20-something, about ready to go on stage with one of the greatest conductors of our time. Ormandy turns to him and says, "You nervous, kid?" And Daniel says, "No." And he says, now late in life, as a much wiser, older man, he said, only a 20-year-old would have the moxie to think that he could pull this off, but he did. And so it's a great little tale, and that didn't make the documentary, but it's in the book. So anyway.
And therefore, Daniel Epstein performed it in China.
No, Daniel Epstein did not perform it in China.
Okay.
Only in Saratoga. Yin, the guy who was
actually did. Okay.
Yeah, Yin Chenzong. He was one of the favorite musicians of Madame Mao. He was, she had a soft spot for him, but he was also the lead person behind composing the Yellow River Concerto.
A question that I ponder a lot about China. Well, there are many questions I ponder about China, but one of them is, my area of expertise is Italy, and I've come to believe that in terms of what world civilization uses, for the most part, if Egypt or Greece didn't give it to us first, then either Italy or China gave it to us. And I'm not talking about noodles. I'm talking about just about everything that we use in our world.
Yeah.
And China, because of its huge population, its ancient history, when I went there, I kept having the feeling, and this was not a negative feeling, that in their view, they were the center of the world. Mm-hmm. And that all the rest of us were in the world, but they were the center of the world. Mm-hmm. And that was not an unpleasant feeling for me. It was just a fascinating thing to observe. Mm-hmm. Another is that even when nations are under different governments, I went to the Soviet Union in the 1970s. It was an oppressive place to be, but you also felt it was a big country. Mm-hmm. And in big countries, I've often encountered very warm people. Mm-hmm. In ways that smaller countries like Hungary, not that they're not warm there, but they work a lot harder to maintain their identity. Mm-hmm. Big countries don't have to do that. Mm-hmm. And I had the same feeling in 1996 China as I did in 1979 Soviet Union, as I've had in the United States, as I've had in Brazil, in very large countries. And I guess what I wonder about now, to the degree that you think you can talk about this, is how the Chinese saw themselves in the world then, and how they see themselves in the world now.
Musically or
every way?
Well, wow, that's a big question, Fred. We could talk another hour about that, but like in a nutshell, 73, when the orchestra went, China was a closed society. China was in a chaotic state politically. Mao died in 76. The person who took over from him was Deng Xiaoping, and he was the one who really kind of took the controls off and allowed the economy to develop. Fast forward to 2022. I mean, it's remarkable how China has transformed in a generation, basically. Mm-hmm. It's like going from 0 to 100, like in a split second. Actually, when you look at orchestral music, symphonies, the classical music scene in China, it's almost like a microcosm of where China back in 73, like the Central Philharmonic, was not up to the standards of the Philadelphia Orchestra, and they were so thwarted in terms of, their musicians were sent to the countryside to work. So, if you look at just classical music as a microcosm, it was so stunted back in 73. Today, China produces some of the greatest musicians of our age. Lang Lang, Yu Zhao Wang, Chinese orchestras, and again, I am not an expert, but Chinese orchestras before the pandemic were touring the United States. And I defer to the musicians who I know, the National Center for the Performing Arts. It goes by the acronym NCPA. They sent their orchestra to Philadelphia. I think it was like 2017, maybe. And I asked like Larry Gritko, one of the violinists, Larry, what did you think? He said they were tremendous. And when you look at orchestras in the United States, you talk about the big five, Philadelphia, New York, Cleveland, Boston, all of them. You know, there are Chinese-born musicians who are now part of those orchestras. There are some Chinese-born conductors who are rising through the ranks. The New York Symphony Orchestra has a Chinese-born conductor. So if you go to the top conservatories in the country, many of the students, again, pre-pandemic, but many of them are Chinese.
And there's a Juilliard in China.
Yeah, there's now a Juilliard branch in Tianjin. New York Phil goes to Shanghai, prior to the pandemic, they were going about every year. So, I mean, it's just, to me, the first time I went to China was 1979. And I was a 20-year-old. So, and remembering China the first time I was there and seeing China today, it's hard to get the mind around what has happened there. And it has been a process that's been proceeding at just Mach speed. And you see it, economically, and you see it within the classical music world. Politically, that's a whole nother topic. But at least classical musicians, there's been a lot of, the evolution is just astounding. The concert halls too. Did you go to any when you were there?
In Beijing.
But that would have been kind of the dumpy one, I think.
It was dumpy.
Yeah. So
everybody was so nice, and they loved welcoming me, because at that time there were not many Americans walking around, even in '96.
Yeah.
And those who were not asking to see Chinese opera, Peking opera, which I adored.
Yeah.
And asking to see musical venues, and people, they were cautious but open.
Yeah.
They wondered why I wanted to go, but then when I explained my background, they were very welcoming. And, when you meet on the musical plane, people are very sharing.
Yeah.
So I'm holding something in my hand that you may or may not have seen in China.
Okay.
I wrote one of the most read textbooks in America for opera and one for Classical Music 101.
Oh.
This is the Chinese edition.
Wow.
Which has sold a lot better than the American. The American is sold fine, but in China it's a bestseller, because this is my indication of how big the interest is in China.
Yeah.
That people genuinely wanted to know about classical music. I don't read any Chinese, and so I don't know whether 101 was translated. For people not in America, 101 means usually your first course in university. So if you're studying French 101, it's your first class.
Yeah.
But I know by the sales that there is an ongoing interest in China. I know because I see conservatories being built. So it makes me wonder, at what point did the Chinese authorities, to use the journalistic word, decide that Western classical music was not only acceptable, but perhaps worth embracing?
Yeah. So Mao died in 1976. And when that happened, the Cultural Revolution ended. And all the controls that had been placed on musicians were lifted. So they could, in the documentary, one of our experts who's in the film talks about how it was 1977 when they broadcast Beethoven's Fifth live. The Chinese film was performing it, and that for musicians, when they heard that on national radio, they knew that the Cultural Revolution was over.
Yeah.
Jiang Zemin, who was president of China when I lived there in the 1990s. He was a classical music aficionado, and he placed, a lot of emphasis on music education. And again, this comes through in the documentary, not in the book, but China has been investing a lot in music education. And as we all know, in the United States, that is not the case. Many school districts have to cut back on the arts because of budget concerns. So in China too, it's not like the free market system that we have here that you discussed at the outset, Fred. In China, the government supports orchestras. They support conservatories. It's not, you're on your own. So, that makes a big difference too.
I remember when the 20th century was ending and a lot of publications such as Time magazine were doing retrospective issues, and many came up with the quote, most important person of the 20th century. And I was asked to contribute a comment, and I said, there's not one, there's two. In the first half, it would be Winston Churchill. In the second half, it would be Deng Xiaoping. Because I really think that he's a figure that we need to look at as responsible in every way for what we now have with China, and therefore the balance in the world. Nixon and Mao and Zhou Enlai may have opened the door, and that was all and Kissinger, and that was all very important. But the direction it took, it could have gone in many directions.
Yeah.
And I think, did you ever meet Deng Xiaoping?
No, I never met Deng Xiaoping.
Okay.
Although I did go to a press conference with Jiang Zemin, but that was about as close to power as I got.
Yeah.
One point I wanted to make, Fred, this follows up on something you said earlier, is when I was making the film, I traveled to China 4 times, 3 times with the Philadelphia Orchestra and once with the Curtis Institute, a quartet. And, when you go to China and you go to a concert, you immediately notice some things like the audience. It's very young. You see a lot of families. You see a lot of parents and young kids, like I'm talking 5 and 6, and there's a real curiosity, an interest in classical music. And then you go to like some of these venues are just astounding. And I'll never forget, I think it was 2017, when the Philadelphia Orchestra was performing Beethoven's Ninth. And afterwards, Yannick, or maybe it was 2019, I forget, doesn't matter. But afterwards, Yannick was signing CDs, Deutsche Grammophon CDs. And you would not have believed the line of people. There must have been 200 people waiting to get his autograph. I mean, he is treated like a rock star. So there is this energy in China, in the classical music world. And I think that helps everyone. The Philadelphia Orchestra, alas, just announced yesterday that they're not going to be going to China next year, which is the 50th anniversary of this 73 tour. The reason being COVID. China is still very strict in terms of how its COVID protocol. So that's disappointing. But prior to the pandemic, there was a lot of energy coming from China, and that kind of benefits everyone. All of the major orchestras include Beijing and Shanghai on their touring schedules. You see them all. So what happens when we come out of this period, we'll find out.
An important thing that I want readers to go to rather than us discussing it later in your book is, let's call it the legacy, the impact. And we've been discussing that to some degree now, but about how China is becoming or has become a classical music superpower and the meaning of it. And it's very eloquently discussed in your book, including Yannick Nézet-Séguin. A question popped in my head about an hour ago that I have never asked anyone, and you might be the person to ask. The great American composer John Adams wrote an opera, a wonderful opera called Nixon in China. Do you know if the Chinese know that opera? Have they seen it? What they think of it?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer, Fred. I don't know. That's a really good question, and I'm afraid I do not know the answer. But
Well,
they
I'm going to
should
send our conversation to John Adams and see if he will let me know, because I mean, it's a wonderful opera. Have you seen it?
Yeah, I have not. I have to
Okay,
plead
so
ignorance.
there are videos.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful opera because it hints at the power of music.
Yeah.
It hints at the power of imagery and diplomacy. It
Hmm.
hints at the jousting, particularly between Nixon and Zhou Enlai.
Hmm.
Mao is sort of a figure in the back. He's there, but
Hmm.
it's kind of like going to see the Wizard of Oz, that you have to be
Hmm.
taken by Zhou Enlai to Mao, whereas
Yeah.
Nixon lands in China and there's a jet, the Air Force One, the American jet,
Yeah.
and he comes down the steps with his wife, Pat Nixon.
Hmm.
And it's a fantastic operatic moment,
Hmm.
but he's not greeted by Chairman Mao, he's greeted by
Right.
Zhou Enlai.
Yeah.
And therefore, getting to Mao is really the
Yeah.
destination and the climax for Nixon. And there are toasts, and it's much of
Yeah.
what we saw in newsreels, but it's not an enactment of that. It's a musical exploration of the cultural, personal, political dynamic between these men, and to some degree between the two women, Madame Mao and Pat Nixon, who is not a shallow character, but she's portrayed as much more reserved than Madame Mao.
Hmm.
It's a wonderful work and an example of great contemporary opera.
Yeah, I'm going to put it at the top of my viewing list. So
Yeah.
thanks for that recommendation, Fred.
So did I leave anything out that you want to discuss? Because I think readers know I'm going to show the book again,
Yes.
that I love this book. It was
Good.
fascinating. You don't have to be a music lover to love Beethoven in Beijing by Jennifer Lin. It's a great read because it's about politics, culture, government, everything, and logistics and egos, and
Mhm.
it is gripping. It was like
Great.
reading a page-turning adventure novel that
Thank
happened.
you, Fred. Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you. And they can still see the documentary if you're a PBS Passport member. It's streaming on that service.
Okay.
Because it
For
was
people
on,
not in America, PBS
yeah,
is the public broadcasting system or service. I think system,
I don't
uh,
know. I think
but
so. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
and it is PBS is worth supporting anyway. It's a fantastic cultural resource in
Mhm.
America. And one of their great series is known as Great Performances, that has presented all of our national companies and many companies abroad, and
Mhm.
documentaries such as yours.
Yes. Yeah.
So, did I leave anything out?
I don't think so, Fred. This was delightful. Thank
I
you.
enjoyed it too. Jennifer Lin, thank you so much. And
Yes.
I hope one day to meet you in person, pre-pandemic, during, who knows when, how.
Yes.
But as the world adapts, we will adapt with it.
Yes.
I thank you very much.
Thank you, Fred. I've
Yeah,
enjoyed it.
she.
Okay. 谢谢。